My name is Brian Delgado. I'm a doctoral candidate at Portland State University. I also work for Intel Corp. I'm currently focused on UEFI firmware security, and I've been very involved in Intel's STM project over the years. So it's great to see all the interest in STM, and it would have been cool to hear about it a couple years ago too, but it's nice to hear about it now. So today I'll be talking about EPA-RIMM, which is a research project at Portland State University aimed at detecting rootkits in operating systems and hypervisors. So I think we've all seen the headlines, and attackers are going deeper and deeper into the systems, targeting virtual environments, and that is beneficial for them in several aspects. They deepen their control on the platform. They can also compromise just not one customer's data, but potentially thousands of customers' data. And we also know from reports that these attacks are going unnoticed in many cases, and often it's external entities that are tipping off companies that they've been attacked, and they're not even aware that these compromises have occurred. So it's a significant issue and a growing one. We did a quick survey of looking at how many Xen and Linux privilege escalations there has been in the last few years, looking through the CVE database for arbitrary rights to host memory or issues listed as privilege escalations. And we see this as an issue that's not going away. So even in 2017, there's been a number in the 25 range for both Linux and Xen in terms of allowing these deep compromises into those environments. So researchers are reacting in different ways. I think we're all familiar with antivirus, looking into the application space, looking for viruses. But as attackers get deeper, like into the OS, then we can bring out techniques like virtual machine introspection. So if we can look into these virtual machines and try to identify that they've been compromised. But then again, attackers go deeper. What if they get into the hypervisor? So at this point, what's the lower layer? Is it nested virtualization? There's some heavy performance cost for that. On x86 platforms, there's also SMM. So this is exactly what Eugene talked about, system management mode. And fortunately, you've laid a lot of the groundwork, so I don't have to do the 101 here. But there have been academic approaches for doing introspection of hypervisors. For example, hypersentry and hypercheck. But these approaches have their own limitations. One of their key gaps is that they take far too long inside system management mode. And based on our study, which I'll talk about in upcoming slides, there can be some very negative system impacts, performance impacts, when you spend far too long in SMM. And related work also is the STMPE we heard about. And in some ways, we're similar to that approach. Some ways we differ. And I'll try to get into that a little bit. By the way, this is a very short talk. I've been getting about 15 minutes, so I'll try to be brief. We also leverage the STM. So this is a technique that allows us to minimize the permissions that we give to our measurement agent. So if you think of the classic approaches that gave full access to all of the powers of SMM to the measurement agent, we can start to begin to apply the principle of least privilege to our measurement agent and restrict it from accessing the full memory space or changing MSRs or control registers. I talked a little bit about performance. Intel has a tool called BIOS bits that generates warnings if SMIs take longer than 150 microseconds. So you can think of that as a rule of thumb about how long should typically be spent in system management mode. Based on our studies, we've seen that we start to notice some significant issues around 1.5 milliseconds. So there's a bit of headroom to go beyond that 150 microseconds. But after that point, we start to see issues like maybe your USB drivers for your speakers are starting to complain, or maybe the YouTube audio gets garbled, which is we see that about 10 milliseconds. There's also correctness issues. Depending on your kernel version, sometimes the time spent in SMM is billed to a process, or sometimes it's dropped on the floor. Your game performance can degrade. There's all sorts of issues that can occur as you spend longer and longer in a system management mode. And these academic approaches like hypersentry, hypercheck, take in the order of 35 to 40 milliseconds, which is orders of magnitude greater than where we really want to be with these types of inspections. If you're interested in more details, we look into some of the performance aspects, some impacts on device drivers. There's a paper there that provides all the details. Traditional approaches have also had challenges. If you think about when the CPU is interrupted due to an SMI, you could end up with the context of the virtual machine instead of the hypervisor that you want to be looking at. So Sentry had an approach that really changed the flow of SMI processing, and they used performance counters in ways that weren't designed to be used in order to trigger fallbacks to the VMX root mode, the hypervisor context. It was not a very, one could say, elegant solution. So with STM, we get better access to these data structures. Also, the traditional approaches basically grant full permissions to their measurement agent. So in today's world, that's generally not a good idea. We want to limit the amount of power given to SMM just to what's required. So that's also a gap with these traditional approaches. So that brings us to EPA-RIMM. So our goal is to really look for persistent rootkits that are in the hypervisors or operating systems. And essentially, we're looking for deviations from a baseline measurement. So we will gather a baseline at a known good time of the system, and then look for deviations from that over an extended period of time. We put our measurement agent in a deprivileged virtual machine of the STM. So STM provides different knobs to restrict what the SMI handler is allowed to access. Those knobs consist of page protections for memory, MSR protections, I/O ports, MMIO, PCI devices. So you can craft a custom policy over what you want your SMI handler, or measurement agent in this case, to be able to access on the system, both for read and write. One of our key features is our tunable performance impact. So our approach is essentially, we want to take large measurements that would take too long to spend an SMM and decompose them into smaller portions and perform them over a longer period of time. So ideally, this is something you could just keep running over a longer extended period of time and not even have it really bother your workflow, because we can get in and out of SMM so quickly. We also provide a measurement API. And so essentially, our measurement agent is receiving instructions about what to go measure. And these can vary from measurement to measurement. And so some of these traditional approaches basically did the same thing over and over. But if we think about, maybe there's an emerging threat, we need to change what we're looking at, this mechanism allows us to look at different memory regions or look at different MSRs based on either administrator control or an orchestration layer above it. We also don't want to build in any VMM-specific information into SMM, because if we were to change that, it would have to take a BIOS reflash, which is very invasive. So this measurement API allows us to direct the measurement agent externally. And we apply encryption and signature checking over these incoming measurement checks to make sure that we're communicating with our expected endpoint. As I mentioned, we can also obtain the necessary hypervisor context via the STM's ready access to the host software VMCSs. So this provides us with the interrupted state of that hypervisor, which is what we need in order to do our runtime integrity measurements for the hypervisor. The architecture essentially has 4 key components. The diagnosis manager is designed to orchestrate the set of measurements. So you can think of it as this is where maybe the administrator, or if you have some sort of automated security diagnosis that's happening, that would be done at that layer. And essentially, what we call checks will be provided. And checks are essentially measurements that should be done by our measurement agent. And they could return Boolean true or false, whether they have changed or not from the baseline. These checks are provided to the backend manager, which is in charge of subdividing them into smaller portions, such that we can go and measure them in the amount of time that we get with a single SMI duration. The backend manager will relay these tasks in what we call a bin. A bin is a work unit. And these are passed to the host communications manager to interface with SMM. So the general architecture doesn't prescribe a particular host communications manager, but it could be a BMC or other approach in order to actually trigger the SMI and provide the data to our measurement agent. And our inspector runs as a guest of the STM and receives these commands coming in, performs a measurement, sends back task results, whether it's true or false in terms of a change, And these flow back up the stack, and if an issue is identified, it would be caught at the higher layers of the stack. And looking at, for example, let's say we have 3 inspections we want to do, A, B, and C. They may have different costs. And so the diagnosis manager would pass these different inspections. Perhaps there are memory hashes that would be performed, or maybe register checks, but they have different costs. Basically, the backend manager would fill these bins up to a finite amount of space, let's say 100 microseconds worth of work, and we have a benchmarking capability where we can determine how long these hashes are going to take. And because SMM is not preempted by interrupts, then our predictions over how long that these measurements should take are quite accurate. And so the backend manager would take some set of work, put it into a bin, encrypt it, sign it, send it down essentially to the measurement agent, which then receives direction over what it should monitor. And then results flow back up, like I've said. So if we look at some recent attacks, including ransomwares that touch Ring 0 resources, for example, the Sage ransomware actually toggled the CR4 SMEP bit. So this is a bit that protects or prevents the Ring 0 code from executing Ring 3 code, which is potentially under attacker control. If we are able to monitor the CR4 with EPA-RIMM, then we can detect this change over time. Other approaches, other ransomwares like Bad Rabbit compromise the kernel code. So with analyzing the kernel code sections, we can detect those types of attacks. If the Venom vulnerability were exploited and resulted in hypervisor code compromise, by measuring that code, we could detect deviations from the baseline. So basically, we've created several different measurement commands that can be performed that are kind of building blocks for detecting a varied set of ransomwares and rootkits. And looking at performance, with our approach, we're able to get our measurement costs down to below a millisecond. So we're at 0.28 milliseconds, which is even with the STM in place. And so we observed the STM doesn't add too much overhead because the non-STM measurement takes 0.26 milliseconds. We really want to be down by 0.15, but this is done on very modest hardware on a minimal board. And so we expect with higher end processors, we probably can do better. And we also recall that there is a little bit of headroom above that 150 microseconds based on our measurements. So we're kind of close to where we want to be, but I think there's still a little room for improvement. So one of the nice things about the STM is that it can go through a TXT launch, and the AC module will provide a measurement of the STM in the TPM PCR 17 that the MLE can go look at and decide if it wants to bring up the STM. So we have an opportunity to make sure our STM is intact at the time of launch. With EPA-RIMM, we can prevent any writes to system state that we don't want to be performed based on a configurable STM policy. We employ encryption and signature checking in our measurement agent. The challenge we have is that comes at our performance cost. So we're still trying to hit that 150 microseconds, but encryption and decryption adds to the cost there. We export hashes and alerts, so we don't want to send off any user data, anything like that could be potentially actionable. And our measurement agent is fairly small. It's about 2,400 lines of code inside that virtual machine. So with EPA-RIMM, this provides a way to allow integrity checking to be performed on an ongoing basis without really perturbing the user. So based on our measurements, it's a tunable knob. We could spend longer in SMM or less, but it's up to the administrator or the policy about how long these SMI durations will be. And the good thing there is that we can avoid a lot of these negative impacts that can occur when you spend milliseconds in SMM. And our flexibility, I think, is an important feature because we don't want to always be looking at the same thing all the time. So as attackers evolve, we want to be able to change what's looked at from measurement to measurement so that we can adapt to emerging threats. And with the STM, we can reduce the privileges of our measurement agent such that we don't grant it the full access that it doesn't really need. So just limit it to read access to just the set of things that are allowed by policy. So we have a tech report out on ARXIV. We're shortly be publishing another tech report that goes into more detail about our STM approach. So keep an eye out for that, maybe in the coming weeks. And our SMM performance paper is at the link below. So any questions? I've used up my 15 minutes. Yes?
So you might have covered it, but you talked about like setting up crypto keys inside the SMM environment. How did you bootstrap those?
Yeah, so right now that's we have a very basic prototype that we have, and so we're going to need to improve that. But currently they're hard-coded, but that'll need to be improved for if this were to become like a production type system. But yeah, key management inside SMM is going to be interesting.
The previous SDN document also said we know that's a problem.
Right. Yeah, we're going to have to deal with that in the near future. Yes.
How does the SMM communicate to the network? Is that mapped into its space?
So we don't have a network interface in SMM, at least for this prototype here. Currently we have an in-band agent that will generate the SMI, which is not ideal because in theory the OS or malicious OS or hypervisor could be able to thwart that. So we envision down the road adding in an out-of-band communication mechanism, something like a BMC, to be able to talk to this agent, be able to provide it information about what to go measure. But yeah, there is a gap where you have to get the information into SMM and out. And if you don't put a network driver in SMM, then it's harder.
So right now it's just a shared memory channel.
Yes.
Hypervisor to the host and then sends it out.
Yeah, that's what the prototype is today. But I think we'll be looking at how we can refine that in the future. Okay.